Hello, everyone. Welcome, both in person in Boulder, Colorado, and around the world, around the country, around the state, for an exciting panel on reducing polarization and fighting extremism in our state. But as I imagine we'll see, the issues that we talk about are in many ways national, in some ways international issues. I'm really passionate about this issue personally, because to put it succinctly, if we're polarized, we're not going to have nice things. We're not going to solve climate change. There's good evidence that when not having national unity makes it hard to address things like inequality. And it just makes it hard to do big projects as a nation. And so I'm concerned about it. And in the context of university, the public trust in universities has been declining recently, for reasons at least partly related to polarization. And so I want to work against that too. And I'm really delighted to have a distinguished panel here from all over the state and different professions and different walks of life and potentially different political persuasions. And so just to introduce our panelists, Laureen Boll, sorry, they're not sitting in the same order on my sheet, is the Colorado State Coordinator of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, or FAIR. In 2021, she retired from a 23-year career as an employee benefits strategist and began a new role as a volunteer advocate for liberal democracy. She now leads the Douglas County chapter of FAIR, which is a community-focused grassroots movement that promotes individual dignity and excellence in our K-12 education system and stands against what it describes as the encroachment of an intolerant and racist ideology in our schools, and encourages parents, teachers, and kids to adopt a pro-human approach. The parent organization FAIR, which is at least national, possibly international, also works in business, healthcare, and the arts in addition to education. Bernie Busher is of counsel with the law firm Ireland, Stapleton, Pryor, and Pascoe PC. A lifetime resident of Grand Junction, Bernie practiced law in Grand Junction with Williams, Turner, and Holmes for 14 years and served as president and CEO of Westar Aviation from 1986 through 1995. He served 2 terms in the Colorado General Assembly as secretary and served 2 years as Secretary of State for Colorado under Governor Bill Ritter. For 4 years, Bernie was the Deputy Attorney General managing the State Services Section Office, and he has served on approximately 40 nonprofit boards. In 2022, apropos of our meeting today, he was one of the founding members of Restore the Balance, which fights extremism in politics and is based in Mesa County, Colorado. Martine Carcassonne is a professor in the Communication Studies Department of Colorado State University and is the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. His research focuses on helping local communities address wicked problems more productively through improved public communication, community problem solving, and collaborative decision making. The CPD is an impartial resource dedicated to enhancing local democracy. Martine and the CPD staff train students to serve as impartial facilitators who then work with local governments, school boards, and community organizations to design, facilitate, and report on innovative projects and events and key community issues. On a similar vein, I'm proud to introduce our very own CU Boulder faculty member, Leah Sprain, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she also directs the Center for Communication and Democratic Engagement. And she and I are 2 of 3 faculty fellows this year for higher education and democracy with the Office of Outreach and Engagement. Katie's in the back. Her research focuses on how specific communication practices facilitate and inhibit public action, and outreach and praxis are crucial to democratic engagement, and thus much of her research is collaborative and focused on practice theory interface. I'm Matt Burgess. I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies and a fellow of CERES, which is the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, and I'm a faculty fellow at the Benson Center, which is the sponsor for this organization, or for this meeting. So you all work for different organizations that in different ways address this issue of polarization and extremism. And so just to start, can each of you tell us about your organization? And so specifically, what are their missions and what inspired you to join and work for the organizations that you work for? We can just go down the line.
I don't work for board. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah. Anyway, 7 of us got together. We put up I'll run through those very, very quickly. We believe that political parties should compete over values. We believe that facts supported by evidence are the basis for our political beliefs and how we should act. We believe that no one has a monopoly on the best public policy proposals. No party has a monopoly. We believe that public interest must come before party interest. Problem solving is more important than fundraising. And we believe that citizens should be able to run for public office without being intimidated or threatened. And we believe that citizens should embrace responsibility. And we wrote this op-ed and we put up a website. And we invited people to sign on. And lo and behold, over 2,000 people in our community signed on. And we go, well, what do we do now? So we held a public meeting and we rented a big space. The comment that I got that day was, thank you. We were starting to believe that we were the last people that weren't going crazy in our community has had some political turmoil with a clerk and recorder that you've all read about in the newspaper, and a member of Congress that has also managed to get into the newspaper occasionally. And so there was a lot of turmoil. We've, shall I say, progressed from there. We did public surveys of all of the candidates and graded them red, green, or yellow, not on what their position was on guns or abortion, but on their willingness to talk to people. Their refusal to say that somebody that disagreed with them was an evil person. We graded them on their civility. And the Sentinel was very, very gracious and ran our gradings of 2 full-page ads, Sundays apart. And we think we made some difference. In the last election, moderates tended to win in Mesa County. We're at this point trying to decide where do we go from here? But we think we hit a chord that is strong.
Hi, I'm Laureen Boll, and I'm a long-term resident of Douglas County, which is south of Denver. And what brought me to FAIR was just about 2 years ago. At the time, I still had a kiddo at home in high school. And like a lot of other parents with COVID, I really started paying attention to school board meetings and hearing the conversations going on and decisions being made, and started to grow concerned. And then the school board approved an equity policy. And I and other parents decided I remember this day very clearly, it was National Margarita Day. And I bet you didn't know there was such a day. And we were, coming out of COVID and excited to get together and go have a margarita. And we all got our phones out and said, have you all looked at this equity policy? What is this about? And we had a lot of questions, and we started engaging or trying to engage with the school board and in getting our questions answered. And we felt like we were talking to a wall. And so things started happening at my workplace as well, that after George Floyd, that there was this kind of obsession started with race and focusing on our differences. And this is a company I had been with for 20 years. And it felt like things were just changing and I didn't know what was going on. I felt alone in my concerns. And about that time is when I read about this new organization, nonprofit organization called FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And the founder of FAIR was in a similar situation in that his kids in New York City going to a private school were being encouraged to join affinity groups based on their skin color. And parents were also being encouraged to meet other parents who shared a similar melanin. And he just thought, this just isn't right. Something is going awry with our civil rights movement from years ago, from decades ago. So FAIR is a nonprofit, and I'm a volunteer. I don't work for FAIR. I wish I did. But FAIR is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. It really is a civil rights organization, and that its mission is to uphold the civil rights and liberties of all Americans. And we have a legal team, most of whom are volunteers, but really pointing out to universities, to school districts, to employers, situations where employee civil rights are being violated, and it is happening. And another mission of FAIR is to create a common culture of fairness, understanding in our humanity, and that is really happening at the grassroots level, and that's where I feel like I am having an impact. And in Douglas County, we really quickly grew to 3 of us sharing margaritas to about 700 of us now, and it's really been so empowering to see what our parents will do when they are informed and they're engaged and they will advocate for their kids, and they are very respectful in their conversations with their teachers, with principals, with the board. And they have been able to enact change, and it will be meaningful change because it's coming from the community. It's not coming from up high. So that's what FAIR is about. And I'm thrilled. This has been a fabulous journey. If somebody would have told me 3 years ago that I'd be sitting here talking about this, I would say, you were crazy. I never anticipated that this would happen, but as I say, the stars aligned, things happened, and I just could not stand on the sidelines and watch my community succumb to this ideology, and they've successfully pushed back. So I'm super proud of my community.
Switch the pattern here for a second. I think you'll see after chronologically it might make more sense. But and as I was driving down here from Fort Collins, I heard today was Tater Tot Day. So I think we should all go get some tater tots and margaritas afterwards. I was hoping there'd be some here, but not. Yeah, so I'm Martine Carkson, as you heard from the introduction. So I'm a communication professor. Basically, for the last 20 years, the focus of my work has been, how do we have the tough conversation? How do we talk to each other? How do we make decisions together, particularly to address our shared problems? My early academic work was in this subfield of argumentation, like how do people make arguments? And what kind of sources and resources and evidence and fallacies and logic and all that stuff. But also in terms, I was always interested in how emotion works in there, how narratives and story work in there, and particularly a big focus of my work is how people use values. How do people talk about values? Sometimes explicitly, often implicitly, and how does that help either bring us together or divide us? Unfortunately, people tend to use values badly to divide us a lot more than bring us together. My early work was much more national politics. My dissertation, for example, focused on how presidents from Johnson to Clinton talked about welfare and poverty issues. And I've always been interested in the intersection between expertise and democracy and how that kind of works together and how data comes in. And I was doing well as an academic. I was publishing lots of papers, but all my papers were basically about how badly we were talking about tough issues. And it was a little depressing. And I was looking at a 40-year career of just writing papers about how bad things were. And that didn't seem too fun. So when I got the job at CSU now, 19 years ago, I shifted from national to local, and I shifted from being more just I guess the term for me was a rhetorical critic, right? I analyzed how other people talked about issues to become much more practitioner. So about 17, 18 years ago, I started the Center for Public Deliberation as this ongoing experiment. So as you heard, it serves as an impartial resource in Northern Colorado. I'm now using all we know about argumentation, all we know about communication, about conflict management, about deliberation, all these different tools out there, and trying to apply them to community to help our community have the conversations we need to have. I imagine we'll get into this with polarization and so forth. I use a lot of social psychology and brain science in my work. Unfortunately, our brains are much more wired for polarization. We really like simple stories, and there's a lot of people out there that take advantage of that. One of my favorite terms is from Amanda Ripley, who's a journalist who talks about conflict entrepreneurs, right? There's people that know this human psychology, take advantage of it to polarize this because it's, lucrative for them or politically advantageous. So I try to do the opposite. So my job now is basically I'm a facilitator and a process designer, designing events, designing processes to avoid triggering the worst in human nature and actually tap into the best to elevate our conversations and help us have the kind of conversations we need to have.
So the reason why Martine went first is I spent 3 years as the associate director of his center. And so him telling his story makes a little bit more sense so that I can be quick. After spending 3 years at CSU, I came to CU hired to do community outreach. Well, I had a letter of recommendation. We still talk. We're good, I think. And over time, found that the ways in which research and outreach really came together with the center was something I was really interested in, and was fortunate to, over time, be able to take over the director of the Center for Communication and Communication and Democratic Engagement. I'm going to mess that up again. And in some respects, we're really inspired by the same work that I was doing with Martine. So really thinking about how is it that we design spaces for people to come together to make and tackle tough decisions. A lot of my work is on environmental issues, so really thinking both about public-private collaborations and the kind of resources that folks need in order to kind of take on otherwise tricky and difficult environmental issues. Much like Martine's Center, we're mostly doing work with community partners where we're not telling them what to do. They instead have problems, or they're running meetings and they want help, and we're available to help them. But then one of the benefits, I think, of being a university center is we both do that work and then we do research about it, frequently learning that some of our assumptions are also flawed. And in turn, that sometimes from practice and the ways in which we engage together, that we can be developing better understandings about how to do things. And through that process, really having kind of productive relationships between both the practical work of democracy in local communities, our ideas about what democracy is and should be, and how, in our case, we communicate in order to make that happen.
Great, thanks everybody for that introduction. So the next questions are for Bernie and Laureen. One of the things that research suggests is important in reducing polarization is being precise. So I want to talk specifically about what extremism means to you and what you see going on in your communities that you worry is extremism in specific terms as possible. So Bernie, I'll start with you.
Well, we teed this up earlier. We teed this question up a little earlier when we talked this afternoon. I've been spending a lot of time trying to figure out what is extremism. I have a bumper sticker on my car and it has the word extremism and the stop symbol superimposed, right? And that's forced me to try to define what is extremism. And I can't resort to Justice Potter that said he can't define pornography, but he knows it when he sees it, right? That's not good enough in this situation. So I've come up with a couple of things that maybe help. I think one clear indicia of extremism is an acceptance of violence as permissible to support your cause. And we've seen that, right? We've seen too much violence in a number of situations. I think that's one indicia. I think a second indicia is a belief that you know the facts, but they may be different than the generally accepted facts or a rejection of facts. It is a divorce from facts. Now, I will admit that that gets a bit subjective, but I'm going to say it. You know, we've got a rash of election deniers over the last 2 years without any facts to support that belief. I think that's extremism. There's a couple of other things. Where you get your news from, willingness to characterize people that disagree with you as bad people. You know, that person's just a Nazi, or that person is just a socialist. You know, denigrating your opponents is extreme activity. So I'm not sure if that put together defines extremism, but I think those are indicia and components of extremism.
Thanks. I've never actually considered whether or not we have an issue with extremism in my community. The term I hear more is division, polarization, and we're told that we're polarized, and we're told that we're divided. In the media, it's, you know, half the country hates the other half. Our political leaders say that we're divided. Even in Douglas County, a school board member, pretty much every meeting, she says our community is so divided. I'm a little bit of a doubting Thomas on this. I'm somewhat influenced by a book called The Illusion of Division, per the title. The author, Monica Harris, who happens to be on FAIR's Board of Advisors, she, through her own experience in living in a very liberal city, Los Angeles, and then for the past 10 years, she's lived in rural Montana. She's been in those two halves, and, you know, her experience suggests that, you know, I was expecting when I moved from LA to Montana, being a gay person, being Black, that I was going to, you know, all the white supremacists were going to surface and come after me. And she's like, I'm still looking for them. So it's an interesting perspective to consider, in that, you know, how much of this so-called division really is realistic. And then there is research, a lot of you probably are familiar with studies. A more recent one that comes to mind is with an organization called More in Common, that does demonstrate we have more in common than not, and that there's a gap in perceptions, in that twice as many people on one side think that the other side has extreme views than in actuality, and that the deeper and stronger our political affiliation is, the greater our view will be distorted of what the quote other side thinks. And unfortunately, education does not seem to reduce this perception gap. In some cases, it actually increases that gap. So I tend to think that kind of coming full circle, there has to be something going on, I think, with the information that we're given through the media. So I don't know that I really answered the question about extremism.
So not quite, although we'll get back to some of the themes that you raised, which are important. So let me ask you a slightly more specific version of the same question. So your organization, FAIR, stands against what it describes as ideologies and practices that it perceives to be illiberal, race essentialist, and discriminatory. These are the adjectives used to describe it on the website. And FAIR promotes what it calls instead a pro-human or color transcendence approach. I think for just the average person in the room, you know, they might see on the one hand things like the election of Glenn Youngkin in a bluish purple state in Virginia, or the huge margin that Ron DeSantis winning in Florida, and also the fact that recent polls have found that for the first time in decades, voters on average no longer trust Democrats more than they trust Republicans on education, right? So they sort of, I think people see that and think, okay, there really is something going on in schools probably that parents don't like. Yet on the other hand, I would guess or argue that most Americans would also agree that there really is real racial inequality in this country, both now and throughout our history, and that ostensibly colorblind policies can sometimes create inequality. So two prominent, well-studied examples of this would be one, there's a sentencing bias where on average, if you control for criminal history and crime committed, Black men in particular get much longer sentences than everybody else. Another example would be voter ID laws, which have probably varying intent, but on average, disproportionately disenfranchise poor and minority voters. So my question is, can you give specific examples, and the more specific, the better, of practices your group sees as illiberal, race essentialist, and discriminatory in education? And then also, can you give examples as specific as possible about what a better approach would be to teaching kids about race and racial inequality?
So specific examples of like an illiberal practice in schools. And we had this encroaching in Douglas County and we stopped it, but it's suggesting that your identity, how one identifies, takes precedence over your individuality. So for example, in Douglas County, there was a professional development session where the consultants were advising teachers that the color of a student's skin will dictate whether or not that child will be successful in life. That to us is dehumanizing. We are much more than our immutable characteristics. So that's an example, I think, of an illiberal, frankly, an inhumane worldview. And it's suggesting, you know, a worldview of victimhood, that a child has no agency, that they are going to be held down by oppressors. And so it's just that view of hopelessness. And I read about this kind of worldview that has permeated more so in other school districts, other communities than what I've been living through. But does that answer the question?
It answers the first part. So what would be, how should schools teach kids about racial inequality instead? Obviously, that's a huge loaded question that you could go on for a whole lecture about, but as concise as you can, what does it mean, I guess, for what does a pro-human approach mean, and what does race transcendence mean to you?
Well, I think a pro-human approach to education, I think we're probably still figuring that out. I think people have different expectations of what education should be about. I think there's a segment of the population that thinks it really should stick to the basics, and follow, let the education of values stick to the family, and let the family dictate that. There's another perspective that children should be educated to benefit society, and that the needs of society should dictate what children are taught and how they're taught. So that a pro-human approach to that would be, we need to have discussion on this. And it feels like what's happening is that there's fear that if the mood in a community from leaders is, let's say, the latter, that we are going to teach kids whatever topics we think is best for our society, and that includes things like race essentialism, that's where we're going to do. And parents are afraid to push back on that if they don't feel that that's appropriate. So I think a lot of this division, or the division in our societies, in our communities, a lot of it stems from fear, and that their parents just don't feel comfortable speaking out because they're going to get attacked. Their personhood will be attacked because we're no longer debating ideas. We're attacking each other instead of having really constructive, difficult conversations.
Thanks. Okay, so now to Leah and Martine. You both work with communities on how to have better deliberative dialogue. And Martine, at the beginning, you said that you spent years before that writing about how it doesn't work, or it often goes off the rails. So what do you find when you're working with communities are the most common mistakes people make when trying to discuss difficult issues? And what are some of the most important practices people use to have better discourse? Leah, do you want to go first this time?
Sure. So I think as we think about polarization in particular, I'm compelled by the argument that much of the polarization that is facing us is what social scientists call the affective polarization, which just is a fancy word for saying much of the polarization is about identity and identity categories and beginning to think about us versus them, as opposed to ideological polarization. So not necessarily about people's kind of beliefs on issues, but senses of who we are and who they are. And I think we've already seen some inflections in this conversation about how easy it can be to simplify them from our perspective. And as we talk about them, kind of characterize them in ways that make it easy to advance our point. And so as I begin to think of common pitfalls, I think many of us, without realizing it, speak from these lenses. We begin to talk about folks in very simplified ways. And through those simplifications, fail to recognize the ways people see themselves, the ways people self-define, the ways in which most of us see kind of complexity in ourselves and simplification in others. And through those processes, I think often speak past each other, which my hunch is something we may hear more Martine talk about more, because of the kind of limitations of imagination. And I'm going to go further than that, because we're sometimes in situations where we're rewarded for talking in this most simplistic way about other people because it advances our argument about how we want to see society. And that. So those are problems. I think you asked about solutions. Maybe we'll.
Yeah, I'll try to do a little bit of both. Yeah, so I did a report a few years ago. I got a short summary of it. I've got a few copies for people here if you're interested, or you can email me for the longer report. But what it ended up doing is I first looked at a lot of the research on brain science and social psychology, and the bad news was stronger, right? And that's what I said at the beginning, that we're wired more for polarization. You know, we like to see things through us and them lenses, and you know, we love simple narratives with heroes and villains and victims. And once we decide who's who, we see the world through that lens. And then I actually found some good news about human nature, some positive things. We're actually really good collaborative problem solvers when put in a situation to do that, right? We're just often not, you know, our political system is really bad at putting us in that situation, because our political system, especially with a two-party, inherently the problem can be just the other side versus working the problem. And then the third part of it, then I looked at most of the ways we engage people, and how clearly most of the basic ways, you know, public, you know, the one at a time in the microphone, the school board meetings, two-party elections, and so forth, inherently bring out the worst, not the best. And then the last part, it always gets to your question, was, okay, how can we do this differently, right? So some of the bad things that we do that lead to polarization, and I agree with what you started with. In some ways, I think polarization is our biggest issue, because if we don't figure that out, we won't be able to move the needle on all those other issues that you mentioned that we cared about. But it's also very much exaggerated. We're not nearly as polarized as we are. So good process, thankfully, can kind of overcome this pretty quickly. But most of our processes are just a chance for people to talk one at a time. right? So we have these biases, we have these blinders, we see the issue from very simplistic perspectives, and then we have a chance, whether that's online or whether that's emails to city council or one at a time in a microphone, for people just to express their individual opinion. So with a controversial issue, they might have 100 people lined up and they're just one at a time talking past each other, not really understanding the arguments as they kind of go through. And that just kind of fits that either or kind of simplistic, and it works. Because this gets to one of the points that you're making about your organization, right? So often the goal of our politics is to get elected, right, or to raise money versus to solve problem. So the system, the incentives are off. So like what we do with the center, we have several different components to try and change the conversation. Part of it is having an impartial resource whose job is, I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm trying to improve an argument. I'm trying to help people talk to each other. So we, how we frame the issue, and I can get into that a little bit in terms of framing things as a wicked problem versus making the easy assumption that the problems are caused by wicked people. Most of our events have like a discussion guide or a backgrounder, something. I've made sense of the noise out there and then framed it in a productive way. Sometimes fact check, so they're dealing with some of that misinformation, but we're giving people something to kind of work on that helps them. And then we use small groups, and I train students as facilitators. So 100 people show up instead of them listening to people on the stage or walking up to that microphone one at a time. We can have 15 different small group conversations with a facilitator that's there, that's designed and skilled on helping people actually work through this in different ways. Yeah.
I really like what you just said. And I think that there might be one misconception that we probably don't disagree on. And that's that the majority of Americans still are very centrist, right? They're not extremists. The concern that I have is that extremism is manifesting itself with more frequency. Even in our little old town of Grand Junction, a couple of weeks ago, all the churches, not all the churches, but many churches found an anti-Semitic flyer under their windshields after services on Sunday. That's never happened before, right? Yesterday, there was a fellow that pulled over some folks that because of their skin color, he disagreed with them and started yelling at them. The number of hate crime related murders in this country have increased dramatically. So even though the center is still strong, I think we have to recognize that something is skewing on the edges. And we as a community have to figure out how to deal with that.
One way that I've heard this talked, actually Jonathan Haidt, who's tied to the Heterodox Academy, that would know, I got a chapter here, talks about this in one of his speeches, that generally we've always had these forces that tear us apart and forces that bring us together, right? I forget the scientific terms.
Forces
yeah,
and centrifugal.
Yeah, thank you. And when what's happened, especially if you look over the last 3 decades or so, those forces that tear us apart have kind of grown in strength. A lot of the bring us together have weakened. A lot of those that bring us together have actually flipped, right? And so that we're getting off balance. So I liked your comments earlier about needing to, it might have been before we started, about taking this to the local level. That's certainly what I've done, right? I switched from national to local because at the local community, you do have a lot of common ground, right? The reality is, as humans, is we're wired for us and them, right? Jonathan Haidt also talks about we're not selfish. We're not actually individualistic as a species. We're groupish, right? We like to be in teams. There's a lot of bad from that, right? Some of the worst things humans have ever done is because we defined a them and dehumanized a them and justified atrocities, right? But a lot of good from that too, because the other side of that coin is we care about, there's a lot of power in us, right? I'm actually just reading a book called The Power of Us that kind of gets into that. At a local community, maybe your primary identity isn't, Democrat or Republican or whatever. Maybe it is, hey, you're Fort Collins, you're Colorado or something like that. And how do we tap into that? Not to hide the differences, right? But to give us a base of common ground to rehumanize each other that then gives us what we need to have the tougher conversations about our differences to actually work on our problems.
So that's a good segue, Martine, into the next question, which is for all of you. And that is, it seems like polarized debates, to get into the content of some of them, polarized debates can seems to me they can either be about values, about facts, or about priorities. So for example, there are debates occurring within the conservative movement about what role should religion play in public affairs, Catholic integralism being kind of one manifestation of that. I see it as being basically a debate about values, right? In contrast, there are debates about whether strengthening the economy means having a larger or smaller government, right? Or whether more or fewer police makes us safer. Those seem like basically disagreements about facts. We all agree that we want communities to be safe. We all agree that we want our economy to be strong. And so in any particular time or place, one or the other side of those debates is wrong. And we can use the scientific process to figure that out. And an example of a debate about priorities might be, some of the stuff that I've heard just personally from Republicans in regards to the former president, Trump, in the last election was, I really like what he's done for the economy. I don't like his lying, his anti-democratic instincts, et cetera, but I like what he's done for the economy. I like some of his policies. I like that he's been strong on, pushing NATO to spend more in the military. And so their decision about whether to vote or not vote for him is really about how they prioritize those two things, and vice versa for people who don't vote for him. So do you see this typology as useful? Is there any categories that I'm missing? And are there any one of these types, facts, values, or priorities that you see as more prominent or less prominent in your communities, especially in regards to the issues that make us the most polarized? We can just go down the line again.
It's a fascinating question, and I'm not sure I've got great responses to it. I do think that there's a real problem that decision-making has increasingly gotten divorced from facts. And in fact, I'm concerned that issues as used by the political parties have become weapons frequently to disparage opponents rather than topics to be discussed and debated. And I think that is the fact of the way, that is in fact the way that political campaigns are being organized today, much to all of our disadvantage. Now, I'm not sure that response, but in an ideal world, we'd be making decisions based on facts. But I think there's a divorce from facts and politics today.
Just a quick follow-up on that. When the disagreement is about facts, it seems like it should be easy to make the decision about facts. When you're talking about, decisions based on values, so to maybe think about an issue that's more in the public discussion than Catholic integralism. Let's think about abortion, right? That's an issue where it seems to me at least that the debate isn't really about when does a life begin. It's values and trade-offs between different rights of the unborn child versus rights of the mother that are not. I don't necessarily know that that's an example of debate where facts can get us there.
Some issues like abortion don't lend themselves very well to a fact discussion because there's so many ethical and moral rules. But let me describe a couple of years ago. I did facilitation for national, and they were all royally mad. They were mad at the Democrats because Democrats wouldn't listen to them and they were mad at the public who wouldn't listen to them about both parties were mad.
Laureen?
Is there a particular question relative to my work with FAIR, I guess. How would you?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of the debates that and discussions that you've been involved with in Douglas County, for example, do you see those primarily being about values or facts or trade-offs? So for example, a way to think about it about values would be, either race is the most important thing about understanding someone's life, or it isn't in terms of our worldview. Something about facts would be, we all want equal opportunity. How important is it as a matter of strategy to emphasize things like race and identity? Or when in a child's life is it most beneficial for them to start grappling with these issues? This is certainly something that comes up a lot recently in debates about what we should teach kids about gender in elementary schools. So that'd be an example where it's about fact. You could sort of construe it, and then trade-offs could be something where maybe one issue related to education that this, it seems like there might be a trade-off issue is when people talk about transitioning among teenagers, gender transitioning among teenagers, right? There's I think most people who've looked at the evidence would agree that there are some people for whom transitioning, before puberty fully sets in, improves their life in the long run. And yet there's also, it's an invasive procedure that usually causes sterilization, or at least often does, can have other long-term effects. And there are some people that regret it. And so there's this trade-off as a matter of policy of like, what should the policy be, knowing that probably there's no policy that's going to perfectly cut the line between, the people for whom you want to be allowing those kinds of and facilitating those kinds of medical procedures, and those that would benefit from having more time to wait and think about it. Does that make sense as sort of three examples?
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I think in the K through 12 education sphere, what I've seen where we really debate is we don't debate the validity of each other's values. More so, the concern is that a parent does not want other people's values bestowed upon their own children. I think that's the rub we're seeing, and that again, back to what we said before, they're just, for whatever reason, we don't either seek out the opportunity, or we don't have opportunities to actually make sure that our concerns as parents are heard, or concerns from teachers are heard, like really genuinely heard and understood. And I do think if we had that opportunity, that there could be resolution, meeting in the middle, whatever you want to call it. I just don't, yeah, I'll just leave it at that in the education realm, it's really about the imposition of one person's values on a child, particularly in the realm of gender transition. The real concern of late is that parents aren't apprised of a child who is in distress over their gender. And the school, again, this is what I think kind of one-off situations, but it's very frightening when a school decides, I've got this, I know what's best for this child, and they don't include the parent. So I think it is a values kind of issue.
Great, thanks. Leah?
So a couple of things. I think when you present the range of issues that we've been talking about today as debates over values and facts and priorities, I think we miss the real ways in which that framing for some people is itself a form of erasure. And so I will happily talk about how, deliberative Democrats really are interested in value tensions, and it's not about debate over this value being good or this value being bad, but it's how they're held in tension, and that we're often trying to do complex things simultaneously. And so it's not that, you know, some people care about one thing and everyone else who doesn't want to do what you do is bad and evil, but it's that we're trying to kind of hold things in tension. But before we get there, I think it's important to realize that as we're having some of these conversations about things like race, about things like gender, about transgender kids, that we recognize that not all differences need to be transcended to have policy discussions about them. And in turn, that very framing sometimes positions people as though they are being erased because who they are is not being kind of recognized more publicly. And so I think that's an important piece of how I think sometimes these conversations in communities feed division, because people get told things like, well, we're going to focus on the problem, not the people. And then they hear people say things about the problem and they're talking about them as people. And so that like feels like a really false division when the policy is about you, right? And so I think that same move gets done when we say it's a debate about values or facts or priorities, and we ignore the very real ways in which, for example, relying on racial discourses of transcendence that suggests any recognition of a racialized experience is in fact the problem, is doing that same work.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick follow-up question? So what would be a better way to frame, what would be a better typology or a better way to frame it? To address those issues?
So I think as I think about these issues, there's some really great work that has been done on racial dialogues, studying how they get used across the country by Catherine Kramer Walsh. And part of her argument is, as we think about kind of unity and difference, we need to be aware anytime we're doubling down too much on one side. So if there's too much focus on unity, we have to realize we may be asking too much erasure of differences, and that recognition of differences is itself an important accomplishment. And in turn, if all we're seeing is difference, we sometimes are keeping ourselves from identifying any potential for unity that might be the way we get kind of forward action for joint problem solving. And so part of what I like about that framework is it sensitizes us to trying to do things simultaneously and the real problems with only doing one. I love facts as much as anyone, but I think the second we start saying, you know, those real facts, the other side doesn't get the facts, that makes me nervous, right? And so as we start thinking about things as debates and policy issues, I would hope that we also hold on to the real consequences of how that positions people whose lives are being adjudicated by those same policies, and we try to do both simultaneously. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good answer. Thanks. Go ahead, Martine.
Can open, worms everywhere. Yeah, this really hits on a lot of the stuff that I do, right? So I'm trying to figure out, okay, don't go into 45-minute lecture mode. So I'll try to make kind of two quick points, and obviously can kind of dig a little bit deeper. You know, from the argumentation field, you know, one thing that I use that I teach in that class is making a critical distinction between fact claims, value claims, and policy claims. So it's a little bit of a different, you know, and the notion of claims is, you know, it's not just fact versus opinion. Someone's making a claim of fact. Some claims of fact have a lot of evidence and they're pretty clear, and some not as much, right? But fact claims are answering the question like what is real or what is true. Value claims is more what is good or what is bad. And then policy claims is what should we do? And the work I do, public deliberation is all about that question of what should we do together. But any question of what should we do is going to rely on a lot of facts and a lot of values, right? So I really find that's a useful way to kind of divide. I do a lot of work with journalists now where traditionally they kind of make a distinction between facts and opinion. And I'm trying to kind of introduce this fact value policy as a different way of thinking about that. Partly because my concern, if we really focus on fact and opinion, we tend to glorify facts and then we lump all opinions together. Well, in reality, some opinions are really smart, thoughtful opinions with a lot of backing, and some opinions are less so, right? But the other thing I want to get into, particularly with the values, I mentioned earlier that a lot of my work is how do people talk about values and how do we get into that? And this connects directly to polarization, right? Because the way our brains wire, we really prefer to look at issues one value at a time, right? So we can say, I care about this value, I care about equity, or I care about freedom, or I care about whatever else. So then anyone who disagrees with me, I get to define them by what they're against. Monica Guzman's got a great TED talk that kind of gets into this as well about curiosity and how we love to define the people we disagree with by what they're against. Because and that's easy to we don't have to listen to them, right? We define them by that. So a lot of the work that I do, like I mentioned earlier, I use this lens of a wicked problem. Any issue that we take on, our first step is really to recognize all the underlying values that are relevant to that issue. And any tough issue has multiple underlying values that people care about, and frame it, to get away from just the one value, say these are all these values. And we even make the argument, in some ways, we all have the same values. We just rank them differently. And then individual issues inherently bring up tensions between those values that force us to make tough choices, which I like your trade-off kind of, that's certainly a big part of, I kind of lump it into values in a way. So that whole process fits into what we try to do. When it's one at a time on the microphone, you can just like, I care about this value, next person, I care about this, and we all talk back. We never deal with a tension. So we design events that we're identifying those tensions, putting them on the table, and saying we have to work through that. And when it works well, it's a great example of, instead of triggering the worst of human nature of wanting to see things through this simple lens, I've got good values, and the people that disagree with me reject these good values, so they're bad people. Now we see the wickedness in the problem. And instead of me against you, now we're shoulder to shoulder working a problem. And that's when we actually tap into the best of human nature, which is how do we deal with that tension better, whether it's balancing the tension, whether it's having to make a tough prioritization of the tension, whether it's potentially transcending that tension and coming up with something even better. But last quick point that I'll make is, a lot of people, I push back a little bit on the like, hey, values are what the family does, right? I agree in some ways, right? But I also, every single public policy issue is inherently value laden. We can't say values are just, values are a part of any diverse democracy. We have to understand values. We have to figure out how to talk about values. It has to be something that's part of the conversation. It can't be just like, oh, values are this personal thing that you can't argue about, right? We're inherently going to be talking about values. The more we actually explicitly teach the skills to do that well, I think is going to be critical.
Okay, thank you all. I want to wrap up with a couple of positive note type questions before we get to a couple of questions that were submitted from our online audience earlier. And so several of you have already mentioned this, I think, really important fact that we all need to understand about polarization, which is that while it's true that we're more polarized than we have been, we're also less polarized than we think. And I think part of that manifests in people having inaccurate and often uncharitably so misconceptions about other communities that they're not part of. And so we have a diversity of communities represented here. And so I want to ask this question fairly explicitly. So for example, Bernie, to you first, is there anything about Grand Junction that you think would surprise people at CU Boulder or in Boulder generally, some of whom probably the first thing they think of when they hear Grand Junction is Congresswoman Boebert?
Well, I've been accused of being a member of the Chamber of Commerce way too many times. There's a lot of things that I think urban areas don't understand about rural areas. The thing that I'm going to kind of pivot off of what you just asked. We hear this phrase, war on rural America, war on rural Colorado. And that just really rankles me, because nobody in the legislature, nobody in Congress is really talking about a war on rural areas. It may be true that they don't fully understand rural areas. And I think that's what you're asking. There's some differences. Agriculture is a difference. Concern about water and our natural resources is a difference. But at the end of the day, the commonalities are much more than the differences. We like our wine, We've got a lot of folks that love to go mountain biking. That's no different in Boulder than Grand Junction.
Yeah, I recommend the Cabernet Franc for those of you who are. I swear I'm not part of the Chamber of Commerce. Okay, so next to Leah and or Martine, maybe both of you. You both work on campus, on college campuses, another oft misunderstood place. So is there anything that you've seen on campus that you think would surprise folks off of campus, especially those who might have a caricatured view of what today's front range colleges are like? Or conversely, you've both worked in communities. Are there things that you think your college students would be surprised about regarding the communities you visited in the state? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I'll say one thing is, for the people that assume colleges have this incredible power to indoctrinate their students and get them to think our way, haven't worked with students very much because I can't even get them to read the syllabus. So I think there's a lot. There are some concerns there. There's certainly I've had conversations with some students that don't feel as comfortable speaking freely about certain issues in certain classes. So I don't want to completely, but that is there's some exaggeration there about how much power professors have over how their students think. The quick story that I think might be a little bit of a twist on the question, right? But in terms of ending this on a positive note and kind of seeing this, right, in that recognition that you mentioned that we're in some ways more polarized, but in some ways even less. Another favorite part of all my events, especially afterwards, when the students tell me these moments in the community, because people are coming in often with the blinders on, right? They have the assumptions, these caricatures of the other side, but then they're there talking to them and hearing their stories and face to face. And there's this power of face to face conversation that again helps us kind of rehumanize each other. And we have these aha moments that we love. And it's this moment, it's like, oh, like that's why you think that way. When you realize you're no longer defining them by what they're against, but you actually hear what they're for, and you're actually for that too, right? Maybe it's lower on your list, but it's still a good thing, right? It's this recognition that, okay, I understand. I still think you're wrong, right? I still like but you seem reasonable. And that shift when we have these good conversations. And I think that's one of the responsibilities of higher ed, of teaching those skills and also being a resource, certainly CSU being a land grant in particular, being a resource to the state on helping us have those conversations, right? So we can undo that polarization and tap into something different.
Don't let us off the hook. We're a flagship. Leah.
So I think that Boulder is a place that has a lot of statewide stereotypes. And I think that I say that as someone who grew up in Colorado and didn't live in Boulder, and decades later find myself living here. And I think part of what might surprise people are the ways in which students are more curious, more interested, more thoughtful than we sometimes give them credit for. And simultaneously, they want full lives that have nothing to do with studying or going to university. And often those combinations get them into trouble. They might frustrate people like us. But in the best of ways, I think that humanizes them beyond many of the stereotypes we might have of both CU Boulder or out-of-state students, and also the very same people who want to drink wine, they want to go mountain biking, they want to make the best of sunshine in this state. And I think it is those contradictions that too often we miss parts of.
Thanks. Okay, last but not least, Laureen. Parents who are concerned about things like how race or gender is taught in schools or CRT and whether it is or isn't, in what way, or practice or whatever it is, those parents have been portrayed in a certain way in a lot of mainstream media. And so you work with these parents. What is something about parents in your network that you think would surprise people who have only watched the media portrayals of such parents?
I think what I have found is that we all want what's best for our kids. Everybody cares about other kids. And they're open to discussion. I feel like I'm a broken record here, but I've really seen the power of listening to the concerns of a parent, and really understanding what is the motivation for reaching out and expressing their concern, and that they are, once they get past the fear of having a conversation with a principal or a teacher, and recognizing that they too are human beings, and that change can come about, compromise can come about. And once you're just ensure that you're heard, and that you also listen to the perspective of others. So I guess it's just, what I have found is that my community, the parents that I interact with, they are not closed-minded. They are not just regurgitating some talking points from the media. They're very thoughtful. So I hope that wouldn't be surprising.
Right. I guess the question for all these things is, how much are my questions caricaturing people who might be surprised?
Well, and I think that this is what I have really appreciated in the volunteering that I've done with FAIR is recognizing when we are dealing with stereotypes and we are dealing with labels, and that's what they are, and that we are very, very complex human beings, and it takes time and effort to get to know one another and to really appreciate where we are coming from and why we hold the views that we hold. And so I am a huge proponent of our pro-human mantra. And yeah, that's
great. Thank you. Okay, so one last question, and then I'll take one question from the room and one question that was submitted from the audience. So we're on a campus, and so I want to wrap up by talking about students. What advice would you give students who want to help make our country less polarized so that we can have nice things? Bernie, we'll go down the line again.
Well, I to some students earlier. Am I on? Yeah. We talked to some students earlier this afternoon, and my advice to them was get involved in your community. Go join your Rotary Club, go join your Lions Club, join your professional organization. Find out ways to get involved. Maybe that's joining the food banks, volunteer. Don't just get stuck in your job. If you get out and meet people that are doing something different, you'll learn and you'll grow. And that's how you become a valuable member of your community. And that's also, if you go back to Maslow and self-actualization and all that kind of stuff, that's how you really establish your own value. So just get involved. Do your job, best job you can do at your job, but get involved in your community.
Do what you can to get out of your echo chamber, and really embrace curiosity, curiosity about other people, about other communities, about other issues. Have an open mind. I know that sounds trite, but I know something I've learned in all the conversations I've participated in over the last few years, and paying particular attention to relinquishing this need to try to change people's minds. I now recognize I always did that when I would have conversations with people. I think I'd be waiting for the opportunity to get my point across, so maybe I could change their mind. And that's not a very effective way to communicate. I recognize that now. So I would just say, be curious, ask lots of questions, listen, and try best you can to get out of your bubble.
So the example that comes to mind is an utterly selfish one. I'm teaching group interaction right now. On the first day of class, we talk about one of the classic ways that groups are different than dyads, which is you can have majority-minority splits. You have three roommates, there's two on one side, there's one on the other, and that goes sideways fast. And too often my students assume, well, that's just inevitable. And most of the time, the majority is going to win. And it's not surprising that the person who's in the minority feels bad about that. But like, what else is there? And I think as we begin to think about what it means to take on polarization, learn what else is there on the small level, to the point where you can begin to imagine possibilities that don't treat some of that as inevitable, such that we feel resigned to performing over and over again the worst possible outcome, which is just going along with things and resenting it and treating each other badly. And maybe some practice on like those low-level roommate things, or your friends, or in classes, begin to build our capacity to take on the social imagination necessary to not get stuck in the big things too.
So I've been doing this work for a long time, and it's tiring work. It's hard work, is kind of called. And people ask me sometimes, like, how do you not burn out? And the answer to that is every semester I get to introduce this to a new group of students, right? And students apply for my program. These are pretty sharp students. I know I'm privileged in kind of that way. And just, so the last 2 weeks with last 2 weeks of class of, and just seeing a light bulb go on and seeing, because, one thing about these young people is they want to make a difference. They want purpose. They want to make an impact. They're sick as heck of the political system and the screaming. And, so it's great to kind of give them some hope and some optimism. The work that I do is very optimistic in a sense, and kind of watching them kind of grow. And I talk a lot, particularly for the communication majors, that I don't want you as a communication major just to be a really good communicator in a bad communication environment, right? I want you to take responsibility for the communication around you and elevate that, whether that's your family, or your organization, your community. So take responsibility. Some things you said, particularly, like take responsibility to build the skills, to learn how to listen, to learn how to ask good questions. I train my students to be good facilitators, collaborative problem solvers. That's a huge skill that every corporation needs, but community and democracy needs. And we don't teach them that often, right? We teach a lot about expression and how to write and how to give talks and so forth. We don't have that many classes about how to listen and how to ask good questions. And I think the leaders that we need now, the superpower of 21st century leaders, has to be the ability to bring people together across perspectives to work on their shared problems. So my advice to students is build those skill sets, take those classes that help you play that role, because that's what your job's going to need, and that's what your community is going to need for us to have nice things.
Great. Okay, so we'll take one question in the room, and then I'll ask one question that was submitted by the online audience. Is there anyone in the room who would like to ask a question to the panelists? David, go ahead.
So this is wonderful to have you on here. Director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement here at CU Boulder, and have the privilege of working with several of you. I think that I'm seeing in this discussion a real difference between the description of extremism and the description of polarization. And I'm wondering, given that folks who are anti-democratic in their beliefs or their inclinations will exploit democratic structures to undermine democracy, right? People who don't believe in it will still take advantage of their airtime, will still take advantage of everyone else's good faith, and they're acting in bad faith. So I'm kind of wondering, the extremism that Bernie was describing as being, more frequently occurring, do these descriptions of rehumanizing through dialogue, through listening, does it have anything to do with that, or are those separate kinds of issues?
First, and then just given the nature of the question, and then we can go down.
I think you're hitting on a very important thing. Extremism is rooted in alienation, right? I think we've agreed that polarization is a different thing. and polarization, manifests itself in various ways. A divided Congress that is almost exactly even. No consensus on a lot of political issues. But at the same time, I think the vast center of the country and of most of our communities is strong. The concern is that the edges are becoming more aggressive, more violent, and their language is, to many of us, offensive. And I think we have to figure out a way not to let more and more people spin off into those three standard deviations, which I said I wasn't going to say. I can't help it. Somehow we have to make it easy for people to come back in and not push people out. And that's a real challenge. And I'm not sure I've got any good suggestions, but I think that is. Benjamin Franklin said, and you've got a republic you can keep, and our job is to try to figure out how to.
So what I really appreciate about that question is it gives us a way of both linking kind of anti-democratic impulses with certain types of extremism. And also, I think the link we haven't talked about today is the very real ways in which some people choose to foster and feed polarization because it benefits them, because it gets them views, because it gets them audiences, because it gets them money, because it gets them power, because it lets them affiliate with certain people and denigrate others. And so I think that's very much what Restore the Balance in calling out certain forms of extremism was partly calling out. And so as we have these conversations, what we treat as inevitable parts of democracy and what we treat as anti-democratic matter. The question about whether or not dialogue and deliberation are correctives for forms of extremism that prey on and profit off of division, I think is something to take real seriously. Both Marks, I think you were there. If not, you'll correct me. I once went to a group of conflict management folks, and they said, we try to bring the most people we can bring together, but there's some folks who can't be part of processes because they'll just try to blow them up. I think there are some real limits of who's willing to participate, and also what would be asking too much for other folks to sit face to face with what's said about them. And so I think there's limits.
Yeah, you touched on something I've been working on lately. Haven't quite figured it out yet, right? But I'll because I agree. I mentioned conflict entrepreneurs earlier, which is kind of what Leah just kind of described in a sense. And there's clearly bad faith actors there that are taking advantage of these. And I certainly the processes I run. I have a process like what are the topics, what are the issues that deliberation fits well to really move the conversation forward, and there's some issues that's not the right tool, right? Because some of it, but there's also defining someone as a bad faith actor is defining their motive, right? Or defining someone as an extremist, right? You're defining them, and by doing that, you're defining them by what they're against, and you're basically taking them out of the conversation. So I have this tension in my own head that I know there's some bad faith actors out there, right? That are problematic, that I have to figure out to take on, but I also want to be very careful on who I label a bad faith actor. And then there's also a line between the bad faith actor, say the political pundit, media personality who knows better, but this works great for ratings, and the person that eats that up. they're more of a victim of the bad faith actor, and they're not a bad faith actor because they truly believe it. And I think, you know, they might be someone to change, you know, so trying to struggle with this typology of that and not being too quick to say, though they're bad faith actors, we give up on. Even though the most extreme example, and I always forget the scholar's name, but if you Google, Simon Sinek had an interview with her about extreme listening as a Muslim, female Muslim scholar, does great work. She actually worked with white supremacists. Like normally I would say, white supremacists, I don't want them in my room. Right? I'm perfectly fine with them not showing up. But then when she actually engaged and talked to them and listened to them, you know, found out that most white supremacists, it's not about white supremacy. You know, they didn't join the white supremacist group because they were racist, right? They joined, going back to Maslow's, they needed a sense of belonging, and the recruiters knew how to tap into that, right? And she's been very successful getting all these white supremacists out of these organizations because she listens to the, you know, so got to be careful on how we kind of label those things while also recognizing, yes, there are people that are taking advantage of these things. The good news is at the local level, we're not dealing with them nearly as much as on the national level.
That's a good segue. If Laureen, you want to take that up, because Daryl Davis is one of the founding advisors of FAIR, and he's famous for, he's a jazz musician who shut down several chapters of the KKK by making friends with them. He's a black man.
Yeah. He befriended at least, I believe, 20 Klan leaders, and over a period of time got to know them. They got to know him. I think music brought a lot of these people together, and he has a collection of KKK robes in his home, and he calls some of these people some of his dearest friends, and these individuals have renounced their association with the KKK. So to me, that was a hugely powerful story, and just speaks to how powerful it is when we view each other as human beings instead of these labels. And Daryl, I was in a conversation with him one time, and he said, we are not about fighting racists, we're about fighting racism. So this gets back to that notion of we're here to challenge ideas, not the person.
Okay, thank you all. We're short on time. I do want to ask you this question really quickly, but try to keep your answers as short as possible. So one of the really interesting questions we got online relates to the fact that, you know, people tend to be more optimistic about their local setting compared to the national setting. People tend to caricature their immediate community less than, you know, far-flung communities. And so this person online asked, does that imply that we should devolve more governance to the local level or to the state level? And so even if it's just yes or no, just like keep it to 30 seconds down the line. What do you think about that?
We should keep as much local as we possibly can. But the fact of the matter is some things have to be decided, you know, on a more collective basis.
I agree. Local's best.
Short answers.
I think there's certain things that can be better accomplished at the local level, and humanity benefits from them being taken up at other levels too. So let's not forget that, like, movement between those can be a good thing.
And you know, obviously my focus is on local. A lot of that was for my own kind of mental health and, you know, certainly kind of concerns. But I think there are also, you know, Lee Drutman's book on the two-party doom loop. I think he's got a lot of nice ideas, you know, so I think there's some things that we could do at the national level to change. But yeah, I think it depends on the issue.
But you can't do national defense at the local level, right? Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time. I want to thank you all for joining us, and for our live audience, or our online audience, excuse me. And I guess I just want to close by challenging all of you to get out of your bubbles, both in terms of ideology, but also in terms of location, right? So I know not everyone has a car, not everyone has, you know, the ability to socialize in large gatherings given the pandemic, but to the extent that you do, you know, if you have a car and you're curious about what life is like in Grand Junction or in a rural area, go there. Try the Cabernet Franc. And similar thing, if you're, I know that there are some of our online audience is out in Grand Junction. If you're curious about what you've heard described as the People's Republic of Boulder, come visit us. The food is really good. We have these great discussions. Go out to Fort Collins. So yeah, let's think about getting out of our bubbles, not just being about, I'm going to go, I was watching MSNBC last night. I'm going to watch Fox tonight. Let's make it be about having more conversations with people where we can see each other in our full humanity, and hopefully become less illusioned about how polarized we are and more aware of how polarized we're not. Thank you very much.